All right, let's dive right into this. I want you to imagine an epic, millennial-long struggle. On one side, you have the fight for ultimate human freedom and a direct personal connection with the divine. And on the exact opposite side, you've got the slow, creeping corruption of institutions that are essentially just trying to control you. Welcome to this visual explainer. Today, we are going to be demystifying the truly profound philosophy of Abu Yarab al-Marzuki, and we're going to explore what he calls the Quranic meta-ethical architecture. Now, I totally get it. Meta-ethical architecture sounds incredibly dense, but don't worry, I'm going to be your guide through this intellectual journey, and we're going to map out this whole overarching structure of values together. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the science of metaethics. Second, authority, corruption, and freedom. Third, we'll dive into man's missions, specifically development and stewardship. Fourth, we'll see how Abraham and Muhammad worked toward unifying humanity. And finally, we'll wrap up with a reversed approach comparing philosophy and religion. Sound good? Let's get started. Okay, kicking things off with Section 1, the science of metaethics. This is all about the overarching structure of values. Let's jump in and define the core framework of the author's philosophy. So, what actually is the master science of metaethics? I know, it's a lot of intimidating academic jargon, right? But honestly, we can break this down pretty easily. It's simply the ultimate value system. According to the text, it is the Quranic framework that establishes the universal values meant to govern literally all historical, ethical, and political human action. You can think of it as essentially the ethical blueprint that's designed to guide humanity. But here's the catch. A blueprint is really only effective if it isn't tampered with. And well, that brings us right to our next point. Moving on to Section 2, authority, corruption, and freedom. This is the grand threat to human autonomy. Here is where we introduce the real central dramatic tension of al-Marzuki's text, the forces that actually attempt to corrupt pure religion. According to the author, there are two massive, distinct forces that constantly attempt to seize control of pure religion. First, you have spiritual authority. This is where clergy insert themselves as a mandatory middleman between the believer and God. Then, on the flip side, we have temporal authority, which is basically political dictatorship. This force actively crushes community self-governance, also known as shura, which is the fundamental practice of actually consulting the people in matters that directly affect their lives. What's so fascinating here is how these two corrupting forces totally parallel each other. They both hijacked pure religion, right? They completely strip away your individual autonomy to establish tyranny, and they make you dependent on either a spiritual intermediary or a political dictator. So, you might be wondering, what's the solution to all of this? Well, the author argues the answer is fitra, which is our innate, pure religious nature. Fitra naturally seeks to completely liberate humanity from both of those forces, spiritual intermediaries and political dictators. It actively demands a direct, unmediated relationship with the divine alongside democratic self-management for the community. So at its core, it's a massive call for profound structural individual freedom. That brings us to Section 3, man's missions, specifically development and stewardship. This is the dual task of humanity. Now that we've established this idea of a liberated human, how are they actually supposed to act on Earth according to this meta-ethical architecture? Al-Marzuki clearly lays out two highly actionable missions for us. Step 1 is material development. That means colonizing, cultivating, and sustaining physical life right here on Earth. But, and this is a huge but, that alone isn't enough. In fact, without Step 2, it's actually incredibly dangerous. Step 2 is spiritual stewardship. This means acting as a vicegerent or a custodian and being firmly guided by divine values. So the really crucial takeaway here is that material progress is completely meaningless and honestly, potentially highly destructive if it doesn't have the ethical values of stewardship anchoring the whole thing. To actually pull off these two huge missions, humanity leans on two massive cultural pillars. We've got science, which produces mathematical order and gives us this very objective interpretation of nature, and we've got art, which produces aesthetic beauty and gives us a much more creative interpretation of the cosmos. The text makes the argument that both scientific order and artistic beauty are absolutely necessary tools. They're used to free human thought from narrow, restrictive cultural contexts. Basically, they enable us to look at the universe objectively and aesthetically, which ultimately empowers those dual missions we were just talking about. All right, let's transition into Section 4, Abraham and Muhammad, unifying humanity. This is the historical lineage of liberation, taking us from abstract theory right into the timeline of the prophets. It is so fascinating to watch how this idea of liberation builds across history. We can rapidly trace an arc that starts with the early era. We're talking prophets like Noah, Hud, and Salah. Then we move into the center, which is really anchored by Abraham. Next up is the later era, with Lot, Shoab, and Moses. Now, Moses is highly significant here. His legendary clash with Pharaoh isn't just some old story. It actually serves as the ultimate case study of an individual defying absolute political tyranny and standing up to a whole empire to demand freedom. Finally, we reach the culmination with Muhammad, who the author really fascinatingly refers to as Abraham II. Now, this is where it gets incredibly cool. There is this profound mirroring connection between Abraham and his spiritual son. So Abraham the First fought astronomical idolatry, worshiping celestial bodies, all to achieve the unification of the Lord. Centuries later, Muhammad, acting as Abraham II, fought a completely different kind of idolatry. He fought ethnic tribalism and racism, and his goal was to achieve the unification of humanity. So you can really see how the mission evolved over time to completely dismantle racism and bring all people together under a single ethical banner. And that brings us to a really pivotal quote drawn from Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 48, which simply says, "Race towards good deeds." Al-Marzuki uses this verse to entirely dismantle the concept of a chosen people by stating that different paths were essentially given to encourage humanity to race each other in good works. It proves that the message is strictly universal. It's designed to spark healthy, ethical competition among all of humanity, rather than elevating one specific ethnic or historical group above everyone else. Finally, we hit Section 5, Philosophy and Religion, a reversed approach. This is the intellectual climax of our comparative matrix, where we stack up the greatest Greek philosophical framework right against the Quranic one. We get to see this brilliant crossing of ideas here. Think about classic Aristotelian metaphysics. It moves top down. It starts with epistemology, which is just high-level theory about how we know what we know, and only after that does it move down to practical ethics. Well, Quranic metaethics does the exact opposite. It moves bottom up. It starts right there in the mud with immediate practical ethics and history, and only then does it move up to epistemology and theory. So simply put, classical philosophy starts with abstract theory, while this religious framework starts with immediate real-world ethical action. So just to summarize all of that, while both of these frameworks absolutely seek to understand human existence, their starting points are entirely flipped, and this is crucial. As Al-Marzuki points out, metaethics firmly rejects the idea that we all have to conform to one rigid, theoretical way of thinking. Scholars call that epistemological conformity. Instead, this framework prioritizes the messy, on-the-ground reality of human historical struggle and practical ethical choices way over any strict theoretical rulebooks. And that, my friends, leaves us with a pretty heavy, but absolutely crucial final question. Have we truly freed ourselves from modern spiritual intermediaries and political guardians today? Just look around our modern world. Are there still forces out there demanding to be the middleman between you and your spiritual values? Are there guardians trying to dictate your political autonomy? Al-Marzuki's analysis isn't just ancient history. It is a living, breathing challenge to your autonomy right now. Thank you so much for joining me on this visual explainer. I really hope mapping out the structure has empowered you with a clearer understanding of these complex ideas. Keep asking those big questions, keep racing toward good deeds, and I'll catch you on the next one.